Wein und Genuss wird präsentiert von Flaschenpost, Albert Mathieu, Walliser Weine, Paphos-Weine und Zweifelweine. Durch die Sendung führt Fabienne Pauli.
Herzlich willkommen bei Wein und Genuss TV. Down Under nennen wir das andere Ende der Welt. Aber dass in Australien nicht ausschließlich Bier getrunken wird, ist mittlerweile auch bekannt. Der Einfluss deutscher Auswanderer hat sich vor allem im Weinbau des Barossa Valley ausgewirkt. Einer der bekanntesten Hersteller dort ist Peter Lehmann Wines. Beatrice van Strien hat für Wein und Genuss TV Doug Lehmann, Managing Director von Peter Lehmann Wines, für uns befragt und viele aufschlussreiche Infos erhalten. Wir wünschen Ihnen viel Vergnügen.
We're very happy to welcome Doug Lehmann from Peter Lehmann Wines Australia with us, and I'm happy to be able to ask questions about the Lehmann company as well as Australia as a wine region.
Can we go back to the origin of the family? The name Peter Lehmann, if you pronounce it the European way, sounds very familiar to us, like Swiss or German or Austrian. Does your family really come from Germany?
Yes, I'm sixth generation Barossa Deutsch, as we call it, Barossa German. Our forebears came out from, I think it was from Potsdam. That's where we think they came from, Potsdam, Silesia or Prussia, if you like. In those days, there were 27 families that originally came from Germany to settle in the Barossa. It was in 1844, and ours is one of those. So, on my father's side, going right back, it's straight German. I mean, German married German in the Barossa Valley, and my mother actually is a Scot, so we were perhaps the first to break the tradition, and I married a Latvian, so there you go.
Great mixture. As far as I know, the grape wine is not indigenous to Australia, so it was the immigrants who brought the grape wines along with them?
Yeah, they certainly did. I mean, we're not exactly sure, but reason and common sense would probably say that the Riesling came from Germany with these people. We feel that, or think maybe the Shiraz, which is perhaps the backbone of the Australian wine industry, and certainly in the Barossa it is, the red variety Shiraz, or Syrah as some people call it here, probably came from South Africa. I mean, we're pretty sure the origins of it were in the Rhone in France, but no one really knows how it got there, but thank God it did.
How long has it been there?
Well, the wine industry started in the Barossa Valley in 1842, 44.
So very young.
Yeah.
It's amazing because if you say that the Germans settled mainly in Barossa Valley, you would expect that it would be a white wine region only, because the Germans in those days had mainly white wines. So.
Well, it's funny, Australia was controlled by the English, and South Australia was the only free state. In other words, all the other states, New South Wales in particular, Victoria, Western Australia and Queensland, all had convicts. It's how the British used Australia, and South Australia was founded in 1837, controlled, as I said, by the English, but as a free state. And these people formed a company, the English people, called the South Australia Company, and they looked for immigrants, if you like, people to come and make the state, and that's how the Germans came out and started in mixed farming and lots of other things, but including wine.
Yeah, I think Barossa is probably the most famous wine region in Australia, and it's known worldwide for its great red wines. And what makes it such a special region?
Well, viticulturally, climatically, it's very stable. It's a fairly dry area. Our rainfall is only around 20 inches. No, sorry, I can't work that out in millimetres just at the moment, but maybe it's 500 or something. So around 20, 21 inches, so it's fairly low. The great thing about that is there's very little disease, and virtually none. The soils are very diverse within the Barossa Valley, so we've got very old vineyards, and the reason for that is, again, this climatic thing, being very little disease. Importantly, while phylloxera did break out in Australia back in the 1800s, along with everyone else, about the 1890s, when it decimated a lot of places around the world, including France. It was contained and still is in Victoria. we're very vigilant about it. So what I'm trying to say is that it's never been in South Australia, it's never been outside Victoria. So we have the majority of our vines on their own roots, very old vineyards. Some of the vineyards are way over 100 years old and still very, very sound. Obviously we have new vineyards too because we are replanting, but so you start looking at this sort of ornological paradise, if you like, great, very stable, very reliable, but also going back to the people. I mean, you have this great lineage of history, grape growers and families who started there 6 generations ago and still doing it. The same families are still there. I mean, obviously new ones have come along too, but there's a very strong foundation, there's a very strong ethic and a responsibility and pride in what we do. So you roll all those things together, we're very, very fortunate. I mean, there's certainly other great districts in Australia too, but the Barossa really does have great history and great reliability, great consistency and great pride in what we do.
I think the Lehmann family is something that is really important to the Barossa Valley. I paid a too short visit to Australia last year, and I visited Barossa, and of course the first thing he was telling us was the Peter Lehmann story. And I know that a lot of our audience don't know this story. Your father has become like a local or national hero in the wine world, and he's called the mentor of Barossa. Can you just give us a little bit of the background of that story?
There were basically 2 things that happened. It was, as I said earlier, in 1977, when Peter was working at Saltram, that company was controlled by an English company called Dalgety, and there were a lot of multinationals who bought into the Australian wine industry in the 70s. Philip Morris bought Lindemans back in the, I think 1970 or 71, which was then the largest winery in Australia. Reckitt and Coleman bought Orlando, which is now owned by Pernod Ricard, and so forth. And there were a host of others. Dalgety's bought Saltram in 1972. And all these companies obviously wanted to make money. I don't think many of them did, but what they did do was, at least on a positive side, they poured a lot of capital into the Australian wine industry, which enabled it to move quite rapidly forward in technology, advancing refrigeration and a whole host of things in research and development. And I think that's one of the pivotal things why the Australian industry is where it is. But on the negative side, as far as Peter was concerned, Dalgety said in 77 that they instructed him not to buy any grapes from the grape growers that were supplying Saltram. Saltram grew very little of its own fruit, but bought most of it from the 60-odd families. And Peter said, well, you can't really do that. I mean, we can't just turn it on and off like a tap. So he came up with the idea of forming a company. He got some friends to invest, approached Dalgety's and hired, if you like, the winery. So they bought the grapes from these grape growers, processed it through the Saltram facility, and then on-sold the resultant wine, as bulk wine, to other wineries within Australia. And that was done for 2 vintages and done very, very successfully. In '79, Dalgety's sold to Seagram's, and Seagram's didn't really want to have anything to do with this, and that's when Peter left and formed Peter Lehmann Wines in '79 for the first vintage in 1980. And the important thing was 60 of these grape growers, there were 61 actually, but 60 of them came, 1 didn't, and well, anyway, that was his decision. So that was quite a monumental step, if you like, certainly for my father. So the important thing was that these families, their livelihood wasn't interrupted, and it hasn't been interrupted since, I might add. The other important thing was that in 1982, and this is probably a little bit more where the stories come from in some ways. While the first one's terribly important for Peter Lehmann Wines, and it's, I'll go on a bit about that in a minute. But, sorry, the second important thing was that in 1982, the Australian industry went into another one of its oversupply situations. People have to remember that Australia was exporting virtually nothing at that time, in the early 80s. The big export stuff came later. So it was very much boom and bust in the Australian wine industry. And in '82 in the Barossa, there was a lot of fruit hanging on the vines that didn't have a home. And my father decided to form a pool. In other words, and this was with Shiraz grapes actually, and some other red varieties, he opened the doors, if you like, to all the grape growers whose grapes were hanging on the vines, and they had to pay a fee to have it processed, and they turned it into fortified wine, port wine, and the deal was that they would be paid once the wine was sold, but they'd also get a little bit of the profit, if there was one. And I think, it was quite a phenomenal amount of grapes. It was around 15,000 tonnes that were processed. And it took a very, very short period. I think everyone was staggered to sell it. So they got a lot more for their grapes in that year than they would have got. The grapes weren't left on the vine. So, and then things picked up the following year. So Peter, because I suppose obviously he'd grown up with many of these people. My grandfather, his father was a Lutheran pastor, and very, very respected in the community. So all these things put together made a true story. And,
he's highly respected. Yeah. That was something that you couldn't really see.
So, and now we've gone on from there with those 60-odd people that came, or families that came. We now have about 185 grape growers.
That's what I wanted to say. Thank you for this little historical part, but the future is bright and the present is very thrilling. So how do you manage to get? I saw that you got all kinds of awards and prizes. International Winemaker of the Year several times, the best Australian producer, you had prizes for the best Riesling in the world 5 times, which is amazing if you think about the Riesling in Europe, for instance. So how do you manage to quality and save this quality level and this continuous excellence?
Yes.
Really?
There are obviously a number of issues, I think. One of the most important ones is actually the district itself. We talked earlier about its viticulture, its climate, and those things. And I believe emphatically that wine is probably 60% made on the vine, maybe even a little bit more. I mean, you've got to have good fruit. So we've got a district that grows very good grapes. Number 2 is that I go back to these grape growers, these people that have been there, or their families, since the 1840s. And because this is their livelihood, they take an immense amount of pride in it, and they do a great job. We work very closely with them. We don't tell them what to do. We work with them, and as a team and in a partnership. So we get delivered excellent fruit. There's no question about that. Then we go on to our facility, which is very good. We've got an excellent winemaking team. Everyone works together. And it's just a common goal about trying to make quality wine. And I think we tend to achieve that. So it's a combination of a lot of things. No single thing does it. It's a combination of excellent people, excellent area, and a desire to succeed.
Wein und Genuss wird präsentiert von Flaschenpost, Albert Mathieu, Walliser Weine, Paphos Weine und Zweifelweine.